And here we're going to talk about um, more of the procedural aspect. We talked just briefly, and again, you're not going to be experts on interrogation or interviewing, but we just wanted to hit some of the highlights on that subject matter because it is important that we understand um, what these two things mean and how important it is to your report writing efforts. And we all watch TV and we see all these different shows that are there and the different types of techniques that you might see. And, some of them are a little bit more realistic than others. But TV isn't always accurate. So just, kind of understand that. Okay, so from a criminal procedure side now, let's look at the difference between some of the things that we've talked about. So we're gonna talk about admissions, confessions, etc. So just kind of quick as we go through this, what's an admission? If somebody admits something, what are they basically doing?
Confession. They did it.
In the crime?
So I heard somebody say that they did it. So on the legal side, an admission basically is kind of where a person admits, um, a fact, if you will, that tends to establish guilt, but doesn't really admit to the whole thing. So, yeah, I was at the scene of the shooting. That would be an admission. I admitted that I was there. I was at the scene of this particular shooting. But that doesn't mean that I actually did it. So an admission is just short of what a confession might be. So the confession part is where a person actually acknowledges that they committed this crime in response to police questioning. And they may actually even, a lot of times, they may voluntarily approach law enforcement. And that's happened before where people just admit things. And we have to be careful when people admit things because there are those that don't, they admit it they didn't do it, but they're willing to admit to doing it. So we have to kind of be careful. And a statement is just more of a written declaration to law enforcement where they assert their innocence. I was here at home with my family doing this when this so-called crime happened. So again, the confession is where they actually say that they committed that particular crime. So an interesting case study to kind of show you what I'm talking about. This was back in 1983. And this is a case that falls under a case law, Colorado versus Conley. You don't need to know the case law, but I thought I'd put it there for you. And here you have Officer Anderson working for Denver PD. He's in uniform, working in an off-duty capacity downtown. So he's working security kind of downtown. And this person, Conley, approaches this officer, and without any prompting at all, he says that, hey, I murdered someone. I killed someone. People typically don't say murder. I killed someone and I want to talk about it. So that's kind of an interesting thing, having somebody walk up and just say, hey, I killed somebody. So understandably, this officer was a little bit confused. So he asked the person some questions, which would be appropriate. Do you think you'd have to Mirandize the person yet?
No.
Yeah, not yet. I mean, because really, someone just walks up and says something. You have no corroborating information. They're not in custody, so the officer decides, I should ask some questions. So this person then tells the officer that in the past he's been a patient at several different mental hospitals, and to the officer, the guy seemed kind of normal and fully able to understand everything, but this person is telling him that he has some mental issues. So they pass it off to a homicide detective who took over the case. And at this point, the detective decides, you know what, I'm going to read this person his rights. And he was also able to confirm later that there was in fact a homicide a homicide victim that matched the story that Connolly was, that this person who admitted this particular crime. Okay, so stay with me here. So the suspect, if you will, or the alleged suspect, also took the detective and the officer to the crime scene. And throughout the investigation, there was no indication that this person was suffering from any type of mental illness whatsoever. Now, later during the interview by the public defender, the person started to become a little disoriented and started to hear voices, etc. And when this guy, so they ended up arresting him, etc. But when it went to preliminary hearing, Connolly, who was the alleged suspect, he moved to suppress all the statements. Now, Zena, you were talking about this a little bit earlier. Why do you think that the defense attorney moved to suppress all of the statements that Connolly had admitted to?
Because he wasn't mentally stable, or was later declared that he had mental issues, so he wasn't like really capable at the time, like to when he confessed to it.
Yeah,
when
so
he
I
was
mean,
saying that he was being told.
yeah, so there's a lot that kind of goes into this case. So we have, we kind of asked the question, now what? Well, they had a psychiatrist kind of testify that this person was suffering from schizophrenia, and they, was kind of psychotic at the day before the confession. And a doctor came in and testified that his expert opinion, this person was suffering from hallucinations, which basically interfered with somebody's ability to make rational choices. Because really, what a serial murderer, although I mean they're not all rational, you're not just going to walk up to somebody and say, "Hey, I killed this person." That's not really normal. It doesn't mean it doesn't ever happen, but this mental thing kind of impacted this person to actually understand his, kind of what that he actually implicated himself. So the issue in this case was, were the statements voluntary? So let's talk about it really quick, and then we're going to move on. When the suspect walked up to the officer and made a statement, was it voluntary?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was voluntary. The cop didn't do anything or say anything. The person came up to him, or were they involuntary because the person was mentally challenged, if you will? So these are things that the court had to deal with. Does it matter that the suspect had a mental illness? Probably does. The officers didn't coerce the suspect, so, that should be enough to show his statement was voluntary. However, he had some mental issues, etc. A really interesting study that goes along with that, if you haven't watched the Menendez trial, that's a really good one, where they basically...
I wanted to say that link didn't work.
Okay, I'll fix that. That's good. Thank you. That's a great confession thing where they basically used the adage that they were being abused by their parents, which is why they killed them. But that case study back, here kind of just shows you these are things that you have to look at legally. And the arrest was probably good, but whether or not the statements would hold up in court would really, kind of play out in this particular case. So there's a lot of information when we talk about this stuff here. So here's kind of an example again, and then we're going to kind of jump into stuff here. You discover the body of a dead female who appears to have been the victim of an assault. Okay. There's no indication of forced entry into her house, and the police investigation yields no DNA, no fingerprints, clothing fibers, or witnesses. There's like nothing. There's just the person, as you kind of see right there. The police question everybody who might have had a motive to kill the individual, including the victim's former angry husband and her brother-in-law, who has quite a bit of gambling debt and owed the victim money. So we've got a lot of stuff going on here. Where would we turn to?
The husband and then the brother-in-law.
Okay. Because we have no other physical evidence. So the brother-in-law eventually tires under some, police questioning and stuff, and he finally confesses. The example that I'm trying to show you here is the importance of being able to interview or interrogate somebody in order to get a confession, because honestly, again, it's not like TV. A lot of these criminal cases, they're only solved through confessions and other information that are obtained from other witnesses, etc. You don't always have the cool crime scene with all of the evidence, the bloody fingerprints, the gun, all the stuff like that. And suspects often won't admit their guilt unless they're really subjected to a really good interrogation from law enforcement. So, again, we have to understand the importance of statements, and then you have to be able to write it. And that's what we're going to kind of start talking about next week. So I wanted to give you one quick example, and if you've been in my classes before, when we talk about trickery. So what you have in front of you, and again, this is sometimes walking the line. You have a printout, and I took the person's name and information out, but this is what a DMV printout looks like. So if I were to run your name and I asked for the teletype printout, this is what it would print out. It would tell me your name, your birthday, your address, any convictions for, having a suspended license, an accident, etc. So when I was working in Rialto, we had a series of burglaries, and they were happening at kind of like fast food places, little small businesses. And we didn't have a lot of information. We even set up sting operations, did surveillance. We couldn't catch this person or persons that were doing this. It was hit and miss every time. So what we did is we put some information out to some informants, and we had someone call us. They didn't leave a name, a phone number, nothing. They called basically my desk phone and said, I know who's doing this. His name is this, and hung up the phone. And that's all we had. So we surveilled this guy for like a week. He didn't do anything. We were on him all the time, and we couldn't figure out how to do it. So we decided, I decided we're going to use a little trickery. So I ran the person's name, and I got his DMV printout, just like you see right here. And then I went into my fingerprinting room, and I put some ink on my finger. That's my finger, by the way. And I rolled my fingerprint on this piece of paper right here, on his DMV printout. And this would have had his name and all of his other information on it. And I went to his house, and I knocked on the door, and basically my ploy was I found this fingerprint inside of one of the crime scenes. So he answered the door, and I said, hey, look, I'm investigator so-and-so from the street crime unit. I'm investigating a series of burglaries, etc. And I'm trying to get some information from people in the neighborhood if they frequented these businesses and if they've ever seen anything or heard anything, etc. And this guy proceeds to tell me that no, I've never been to any of these 5-6 places that I mentioned. Never been inside, never was a patron, never bought anything there, never did anything. So I kind of drug the conversation out for a little bit, and then I decided, you know what, here it is, the Hail Mary pass. So I pulled out this paper out of my folder that had my fingerprint on it, and it had all of his information on it, including a picture that I got from DMV that I cut and paste on it. And I handed it to him, and I said, well, if you've never been to these businesses before, ever, how come we found your fingerprints inside of the crime scene? And how come when we dusted these fingerprints, it came, here's your information and your photo. This is you, right? And did I lie? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did. I didn't tell the truth. This was kind of manufactured, if you will. And he proceeded to tell me how he broke into these places and how he needed the money. And, he gave me a bunch of the property back, and he went to jail and blah, blah, blah. And he got arrested, and we solved about 4 or 5 different cases. Now, the difference is when I went to court, I had to tell the judge and the jury and everybody that I lied, that this is what I did. I didn't lie about what he said. I used this as a little bit of a ruse to kind of get him to admit his guilt. And it was kind of a really gray area, but we ended up winning the case, but it wasn't by much probably. But that shows you what we can do, even though it is walking the line a little bit. So, and the corroborating information, even though he admitted to it, was the stolen property in his house. So I was able to corroborate that. So it wasn't just his statement, yeah, I broke in and took all this stuff. I found the stuff in his house. So that was the corroborating information. Okay. All right. So, again, keep in mind with confessions, again, we're talking about the procedural part. Um, there is no reliable data that clearly establishes the percentage of cases where when we interrogate somebody, how that plays a role in establishing somebody's guilt. We can only note that jurors really, they credit confessions with a lot of importance in determining whether someone's guilty or not. So if you get a confession, the jurors like that because the person is confessed, and hopefully you've done it without any type of, um, you've done it the right way, and you haven't intimidated anybody, and you've done it, you've dotted your I's and crossed all your T's and stuff like that. But juries love confessions. Um, the importance for confessions in the criminal justice process would be crime detection because, again, absence any scientific evidence, you get a confession. You still have to corroborate it somehow, but it helps solve, it does solve crimes. There's some accountability when you get a confession, meaning that the person that did the crime actually admits to it, so they're taking accountability for it. It is, in essence, efficient, right? Because it helps speed up the process. You may not have to go to trial. You might still, the person still may want a trial, but it will facilitate criminal convictions more often with a confession than without a confession. And that kind of makes sense. If you look at the OJ case, which was one of the biggest cases kind of its time, it was kind of estimated that the prosecution's case against Simpson cost the taxpayers like $9 million. And that includes, the judge, court reporters, assistants, sequestering the jury, the deputies, security, etc. That's a lot of money. Now, of course, if he would have confessed, maybe it wouldn't have had to go to trial. And it doesn't matter which side of the fence you sit on, whether you believe he's guilty or not. If there would have been a confession, it would have shortened that down. More than likely, he may have even pled guilty. So, you can see how confessions are really, really important. But they also present some challenges, kind of like what we talked about a little bit. There are challenges. One could be abuse. And I know that's a little over the top. I've never seen an officer put a gun to somebody's head before. But, it's just for a dramatic effect, I guess. But, police might be tempted to use some type of coercion in order to get a confession. And it's frowned upon. And that's another good reason to videotape your interviews, so no one can say that you did anything coercive or asked any inappropriate questions or anything like that. So that's another good reason to, videotape. Some of the challenges can be fair procedures, meaning a reliance on pretrial confessions to establish somebody's guilt. It's kind of contrary to the principle that guilt is established beyond a reasonable doubt. So what we're trying to say here is that just because somebody pleads guilty doesn't mean they can't go to trial still. Because a lot of people might confess, but then they still go to trial and they use whatever defense they're going to use. There's reliability. There's a danger that a conviction will be based on a false confession. Do you think people confess to things they didn't do?
Yes.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Yes.
And it happens for different reasons. Some of the more, so it's tough. And we'll talk about a couple of reasons. Other challenges could be inequality. You look at the two photos I have there. Did O.J. Simpson have what? 4 attorneys, 3 court clerks, a partridge in a pear tree, all the hoopla? And do you think this gentleman who got arrested for homicide beneath O.J.'s picture had all of that stuff? The answer is no. So there is some inequality because disadvantaged individuals are not only may they be lacking in confidence, but they might be lacking in money. They might be more vulnerable to trickery or manipulation. So you have to be careful of that on any type of confession, especially if you pose the question, hey, you're looking at 10 years. but if you confess, I'll talk to the DA and we'll just give you 5 years. So then the defendant has to think, well, gee, 5 is better than 10, so maybe I should just take the 5. So we have to look at some, kind of, equity things when it comes to stuff like that. We don't do this, of course. We don't shine lights in your face. Again, talking about false confessions, we have to be really careful because it's happened before. Some examples, and I'm not going to play the videos. You can go back and look at them if you want, but, Mirandizing children. We talk about adults, you don't need to Mirandize right away. Children, you probably should. And depending upon how young they are, they're allowed, in what state you're in, they're allowed to have a parent with them, or etc. So there's lots of different things. You can't violate somebody's rights in order to get a confession. And again, we talked about false confessions before. Individuals isolated in interrogation rooms have been known to make false confessions, even in instances where the police didn't pressure them or manipulate them. And there's some examples. Anybody ever heard of the Norfolk Four? It's a super interesting video, and these individuals, when they were young, they actually confessed to a crime that they didn't do. And we don't really have time to go into it. I just want you to know that there are cases that are out there for various reasons where people might admit to crimes. Okay, the same with the Central Park rapist case. Okay, I have an article and a couple of videos if you want to watch it. They admitted to they were out there. They were actually robbing people, but they didn't do this. So and they admitted to it at the time under pressure. So again, sometimes these things happen. So we need to be, better investigators. Some of the factors in the Central Park case, just to kind of give you an idea, would be something like the police were under pressure to solve the case. They were. The age and intelligence of the kids when they got arrested. It's easier to trick someone that's younger, typically. So, or maybe they didn't understand. If you're 16 years old or 14, let's say you're 14, and I think you did something, and I tell you, hey, dude, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be appointed free of charge before questioning. Do you understand the rights I explained to you? Do you think they know what I meant?
No.
They probably have no idea. So that's important that we understand that age might play a role in this. Sometimes misleading remarks, like, hey, if you just confess, you can go home. That's pretty misleading. And chances are you probably won't go home. Or lengthy interrogations, 4, 5, 6 hours. Okay, how about 28 hours? That a little bit long?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit long. Okay, people will just admit to anything just to probably go home. So these are things that happen. They don't happen often, but they have happened before. So that's kind of why I'm pointing them out. An interesting fact, back in 2014 and 2015, when this accountability group took a look at Chicago PD and some of their arrests, they found that less than 1% of all of the arrestees, adult and juveniles, had a lawyer at any point during their investigation. Okay, 1%. That doesn't make sense to me. So, again, these are all accountability things. We talked about the frequency of false confessors. You don't have a lot of them, and it doesn't happen a lot. But sometimes, again, people will, for various reasons, will confess to things that they didn't do. Here's a couple of types, and we won't spend a lot of time on them, but they have these voluntary false confessors where they want publicity. So they confess to something. Or they might even feel guilty about something they did before, or they might be mentally challenged. These are voluntary. There's the compliant false confessor, which means that they benefit for consideration at sentencing. You're looking at 15 years for armed robbery, Zena, but if you plead guilty today, 5 years. Or you can roll the dice and go to prison for 15 years. Does that feel pressure? That's big time pressure, because you have to think, well, if I go to trial, I could get 15 years, but if I admit it, I only get 5. So, that's something we really shouldn't be doing. Um, and then they have internalized false confessors. These are people that accept the police version, or they fail a lie detector test. And sometimes they actually believe they committed a crime when actually they really didn't. So there's all these different aspects of false confessors. The case of Eddie Joe Lloyd, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. He spent a lot of time in prison, and he confessed in basically in detail to the rape and murder of a 16-year-old. Okay, and he even gave like a statement, a 6-page statement, and did an audio tape that was pretty accurate. The only problem, it was a bad confession. He actually didn't even do it. He was a resident of a mental institution. So, it goes to show you that this happens. Okay. He even took a DNA test finally and found out that he wasn't responsible for it. But because he had, a mental handicap, he basically thought he did. So these are things that we're trying to avoid. Keep in mind for, constitutional limitations for interrogations, those amendments that are important. The 14th Amendment that talks about due process, the 5th Amendment, which is the right against self-incrimination, and the 6th Amendment, which is the right to counsel. All of these come into play, all of these different amendments in here. Just to give you an idea of different cases, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but they talk about, issues that have come up: physical coercion, psychological coercion, what they call the 3rd degree, screaming and yelling at somebody just to get them to confess, or something even worse. When we talk about getting a good confession, if we want to exclude these false confessions, we have to basically have this level of fundamental fairness that we talk about. So the police methods that we use, we have to obey the law while we enforce it. So again, I know I'm covering it kind of quick, but this is just more the legal side for your information. Remember that confessions need to be voluntary. They need to be made freely and voluntary and without any compulsion, which means we can't force you to confess. We can't coerce you to do it. Otherwise, it's going to be a bad confession. I don't think we need to know. The courts, when they look at confessions, when they look at the voluntariness of a confession, they look at if any of these things have happened, whether there was any type of abuse, any psychological abuse, was there an interrogation, was there some necessity? The courts look at all of these different things when they consider whether someone made a voluntary confession or not. Now, that doesn't mean that you can never yell. You can do that, but you still have to, kind of stay within the guidelines. I'm going to skip through a couple of these cases because we don't need to know some of these. And if you want to go through these a little bit later, you can. We talked a little bit about Miranda. If you've never seen a Miranda card, that's what one looks like. That's my old beat up Miranda card that I had forever. And typically this is what you would read to somebody if you were going to interrogate them. And why do you think it's written down?
Sometimes we forget.
Yeah, I mean, we do forget, so that's one reason. Why else? Why else do we have this card?
You have to say it correctly.
Well, yeah, we need to be as close to correct. We don't have to be perfect, but you are right. We need to make sure that we're including that information that needs to be in there. But why else do we have the card? It's kind of interesting.
A reminder to say it.
Well, that's a good reminder. Yeah.
To have them read themselves.
They can read it themselves. That is true. There's one other kind of really reason that you have this card.
Validation that you read them their rights.
Okay, kind of. So
Make
here's
sure they, sorry.
go ahead. You have an answer?
Yeah, make sure they know their rights.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. So when you go to court, a lot of times the defense attorneys are going to do something like this. Officer Gray, did you read my client his Miranda rights? Yes, I did. Well, what did you tell him? So instead of doing it from memory, your answer would be like my answer. I read the defendant their rights per a department issued Miranda card. And the attorney would say, well, do you have that card with you? Why, yes, I do. So now when you have to read it in front of all the jurors, you're not going to mess it up because you can pull out this card and say, I always read my, or I read the arrestees right off this card. So you can sit in court and go, number one, you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand? Number two, anything you say. So this helps you in a court situation so you're not messing it up. So it's just one of those document things. So if you always, when you read police reports, you'll see the officer's right. I advised suspect Jones of his Miranda rights per a department issued card. And that's the card. So you can take it with you to court. Does that kind of make sense? That's the rationale kind of behind that. The big case that's behind Miranda is Miranda versus Arizona. You can watch the videos if you want. But this was a really big case. This guy actually did the crimes he was accused of, but he wasn't offered an attorney, nor did he understand he was entitled to one, which is why the case, this big case kind of came about. So, and here's some, we talked already about Miranda, custody and interrogation. So that, both of those have to be present before you are obligated to advise someone of their rights. Some of the other things that are looked at, courts typically ask whether a reasonable person would be free to leave or not. So when we talk about custody, if there's 10 officers surrounding one person, do you think that person feels like they're free to leave?
No.
Probably not. Whether the officer tells the person, that's a good one. You're free to leave anytime. I just want to talk to you. Okay. The length and intensity of questioning, whether the officer uses physical force, meaning handcuffing. If I handcuff you, are you free to leave?
No.
Probably not. Okay, so this is something the court would kind of look at. The location of an interrogation. If it's at the station in an interview room, it's more likely an interrogation. So these are just some things, again, that the court kind of takes a look at to determine whether or not you're free to leave. If you're handcuffed, let's look at this gentleman here. Is this guy free to leave?
No.
No, he's not. So that, this is definitely would be a custody situation. Same with this one, just to kind of give you an idea. And these are these little legal things that are actually kind of cool that talk about what custody actually is. We already talked about the public safety exception, where there's an immediate threat, where somebody could get hurt. So public safety. So this is the PowerPoint where I actually had the photos. So here, if somebody throws like a firearm while they're running and the officers can't immediately find it, I mean, they can use a canine to try to find it, but they can ask the person, where did you throw the gun? And the person doesn't have to say anything, but there's a good chance that some kid could come pick this up. So that's the reason for the public safety exception on there. And I think we're getting close. We already talked about Miranda. You must clearly inform the person, make sure that they understand. You don't have to use the exact words, but you need to be close, so that way they understand that they have the right to an attorney, etc. So we don't need to know about that. We don't need to know about that. Yeah, so this one is probably going to be, I'll let you guys go through some of this on your own. I don't want to drag out. These are just case laws that I put in here for you. So I don't think we need to go through all that. And then I think I put Russell Williams. This Again, this is a great interview if you want to take a look at it. Okay, so I just wanted to give you some kind of legal points. Again, we're not going to learn it all. This isn't a criminal investigation course. It's report writing, but knowing a little bit of legality on interviewing and some of the investigative techniques is going to be really important for you as we start to kind of move a little bit further into the report writing itself. So that's going to kind of wrap up both of the little lectures that I had tonight. The only thing that's due this week is there is a discussion board, which I think is an interview that you'll see an interview and you need to just kind of comment on it. And then there's a short quiz, which I believe you get to take twice. So I noticed a couple of you have already taken it, but you can take it 2 times. And the system will automatically keep the highest score for you. Some other things just to kind of remember, take the time this week to go through and look at some of those forms that are posted in the different chapters or in the forms area. So, and see if you can type into them. They should be open forms, meaning that if it's a face page, you can type into it and save it, etc. Did all of you get an email for Adobe Acrobat if you need it?
Yes.
Yeah, something should have gone out. So it's for free. So if you need it, you can use it. They should be open forms, so you probably don't need it. But if you do, it's available to you. And then don't forget to take the time to register for the Revel activities that are in the Pearson Publishing. I sent out the links, the codes. A lot of you, thanks for getting back to me, that said that it seemed like almost everybody was able to register. And we'll start using that, I believe, next week. And you'll see some of the little activities and little baby videos that they have in there, which are actually pretty cool to go along with some of the other assignments. I have office hours tomorrow night from 6 to 7. I'll send out a reminder link if I haven't already. But if you have any questions at all, you can just pop in and say, if you're bored, you can pop in and say hi. If you have questions on any of your classes, please take the time to pop in, and I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. With that said, does anybody have any questions before we're done tonight?
No. I think everything is covered.
Okay,
this
so
week.
I did take roll while we at the break, but there were a couple of people that I didn't happen to see. So let me just, before everybody signs off, Oscar, are you here? Okay, so I was pretty accurate with that. Noah, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Awesome. Okay. I'm really going to mess up this name, and I apologize. So I'm going to do this. Miss Acosta? Is it Kayomata? Okay. Claire, are you here? Brandon? Linda? I guess I'm more accurate than I thought. Melissa? Mary?
Yes, I'm here. I had logged in first through my account, and then I logged in through my computer, and it's under the LRC's account. So that's why you have LRC on there.
Okay, that's what fooled me. I thought you looked familiar, but I'm like, I just better ask. Shaq, are you here? Didn't hear anything. How about Alexandria? All right, everybody else I got. Okay, so if there are no questions, please feel free to email me if you have any issues. Hit the discussion board if you have any issues. Pop into office hours tomorrow night if you have any issues. I'm going to render these videos so they'll be up tonight before I go to bed. So they'll be available starting, well, depends how late you stay up tonight. But they'll be posted tonight. So if you want to go back through and review them, you certainly can. Any questions before we're done?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I didn't get the email for the code for the rebel code. I'm not seeing it in my. Where's the code to sign to do I have to register first, or are you gonna give? Did you already send out the code?
Yeah, the code should have came in 1 or 2 different emails, but I will send it out one more time. Actually, at the beginning of this week on Monday, you should have gotten an email that says week 2 opens today or something like that. The code is actually in there.
Oh, okay. Because I thought you sent it to the send out virtual emails.
No, it's in there. If you can't find it, let me know. But you should see it right there.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, if that's it, you guys are done for tonight, and just I'll send out more messages as needed. But that's it for tonight.
Okay.
All right.
Night.
Okay.